Have you ever noticed that the moments that define us most are rarely the happy ones? It's strange when you sit with it. It's not the promotions, the vacations, the good news that carve out who we are. It's the collapse, the diagnosis, the funeral, the humiliation we can still feel in our chest years later. Something about pain seems to reach a part of us that comfort never touches. So here's the question we're going to sit inside for the next few minutes. Why does the suffering we spend our entire lives trying to avoid seem to hold the sharpest mirror we'll ever look into? And there's a second question hiding underneath it, one we won't fully answer until the very end. A man once survived the worst morning of his life, and a few hours later, still shaking, he picked up a pen and wrote down exactly what he'd understood. What he wrote will completely change how the first question lands. Today, we're going somewhere uncomfortable. Not suffering in general, the kind that shatters illusions, the kind that strips away the story you tell about yourself and leaves only what's actually there. And to understand it, we're going to follow a man who didn't study suffering from a safe distance. He lived inside it. His name was Fyodor Dostoevsky, and before he became one of the greatest novelists who ever lived, he was, in almost every sense of the word, a survivor. You already know this feeling, even if you've never put a name to it. The breakup that made you finally see the pattern you keep repeating. The failure that showed you who actually stayed. The grief that made every argument you used to have about what matters suddenly feel embarrassingly small. We spend most of our lives managing a curated version of ourselves, competent, composed, fine. Then pain arrives, uninvited, and for a moment, the management stops working. That's the moment we're interested in. Here's the strange part. This isn't just a personal observation. It's one of the oldest intuitions in human thought. The Stoics built an entire philosophy around it. Christianity built a theology around it. Existentialism, centuries later, rediscovered it in secular language. Suffering, in all of these traditions, isn't just something that happens to us. It's treated as a kind of access, a door into a version of the truth that ordinary, comfortable life keeps locked. Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz, put it plainly: suffering, once it finds meaning, can become the greatest force of transformation a life will ever undergo. Nietzsche, characteristically more brutal about it, said that anyone who has a reason to live can endure almost anyhow. One line, two very different men, same discovery. But what did Dostoevsky actually learn out there? In the parts of his life most of us would do anything to avoid. And more importantly, in a world engineered to numb us the second discomfort shows up, what could any of this possibly teach us? To answer that, we need to go back to a December morning in 1849. Picture this. You're standing in a square in St. Petersburg. Your hands are bound. A blindfold is being tied over your eyes. In front of you, a line of soldiers is raising their rifles. You have already made your peace with dying. There's nothing left to negotiate, no appeal left to file. You are, as far as your mind can process it, seconds from the end. And then, a rider appears, a messenger shouting for the execution to stop. You are not going to die today. This isn't fiction. This happened to Dostoevsky on the morning of December 22nd, 1849. He'd been arrested for meeting with a small group of writers who discussed dangerous ideas, reform, censorship, criticism of the Tsar, mostly just conversation. That was enough to earn a death sentence. He was marched out with the other prisoners, dressed in the white burial shirts they were given for the occasion, and lined up in front of the firing squad. But the execution was staged. It was never meant to happen. It was psychological theater, designed by the state to break a man completely, condemn him, let his body absorb the reality of dying, then pull him back at the very last second so the fear itself becomes the punishment. He was taken back to his cell, still trembling, and before the day was even over, he did something almost impossible to picture. He asked for paper, and he started writing a letter to his brother. We'll come back to exactly what it said, because from that morning on, nothing about him was the same. He was sent to Siberia, 4 years of forced labor in a prison fortress, in leg irons the entire time, surrounded by murderers, thieves, disease, and cold that could kill a man who simply stopped moving for too long. On his way there, the wives of the earlier Decembrist rebels gave him the only book he'd be allowed to keep in the camp, a copy of the New Testament. He read it obsessively, for years, in a place with almost nothing else to read. After the labor camp came 5 more years as a conscripted soldier in exile. He wrote about the whole ordeal later in a letter. Only there, lying in that prison, did I learn to read the human soul. Not in a university, not in a Parisian cafe, in a labor camp, at the bottom of everything. And prison wasn't even the whole story. He suffered from severe epileptic seizures, the kind that would seize his entire body without warning, sometimes mid-conversation, leaving him disoriented for days, convinced each time this one might finally kill him. He lost his first wife to tuberculosis. He buried a child. He sank into crushing debt and developed a destructive gambling addiction he could never fully shake, walking into casinos in Wiesbaden and Baden-Baden, convinced this time he had a system, betting everything, pawning his wife's earrings, writing frantic letters, begging editors for advances, then locking himself in a room to write through the night just to pay off the men he owed. Cornered once by deadlines and creditors, he wrote an entire novel, The Gambler, in 26 days flat, dictating it to a stenographer because there was no longer time to write it by hand. It's no accident that his characters, Raskolnikov, Ivan Karamazov, the nameless man from Notes from Underground, are all fractured souls. People living on the exact line between reason and delirium, between guilt and arrogance, between the wish to be redeemed and the wish to disappear. He didn't just describe suffering from the outside, he excavated it. And that's where the philosophy begins. Here's what makes Dostoevsky genuinely rare in the history of thought. He refused to separate philosophy from feeling, reason and emotion, ethics and raw existence, faith and despair. In his work, they're fused, the way they actually are in a real life. But there's something even more important buried inside that idea, and it shows up first as a murder. Raskolnikov, the student at the center of Crime and Punishment, builds a theory before he ever picks up the axe. History only moves forward through extraordinary men like Napoleon, who are allowed to step over ordinary morality because of what they build afterward. Murdering one wretched pawnbroker, he tells himself, is nothing if the money does real good. Clean argument. That's the trap. Then he commits the murder. Picture it. Not triumph, but a man sweating through fever, hallucinating, unable to look at his own hands the same way. The theory that worked perfectly in his head can't survive contact with an actual conscience. The soul doesn't answer to logic. Try that the next time you're rationalizing something in the dark. Notice whether your body agrees with the argument your mind just made. A second fracture, this time about God, not crime. In The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan asks the question that ends most debates before they start. How can you justify a universe where children are tortured? He'd rather hand back his own ticket than accept that math, heaven or no heaven. Dostoevsky never defeats this with logic. He doesn't even try. Instead, Ivan tells his own legend, the Grand Inquisitor, a churchman who arrests Christ for offering people the terrifying weight of real freedom when what they actually want, he insists, is bread and certainty. So how does Dostoevsky respond to an argument he can't win? With a person, not a rebuttal. Alyosha stays present and keeps loving people inside a world Ivan has just proven, on paper, unforgivable. There's a detail that makes this choice almost unbearable once you know it. While writing this exact chapter, Dostoevsky was grieving his own young son, also named Alyosha, who had recently died from a seizure disorder inherited, most likely, from his father. He gave his dead child's name to the one character in the entire novel who answers unbearable suffering with nothing but love. Not a coincidence. The closest thing in his fiction to an unguarded confession. Sonia, poor, humiliated, pushed into prostitution to feed her family, does the same for Raskolnikov. She never lectures him. She just stays. And that presence starts doing what no argument in the novel manages. Not an argument, a presence. Twice, in 2 different books. And here's the line that made all of this infamous. If God does not exist, everything is permitted. Look closer at what he's actually claiming. His concern was never really the absence of God. It was what a human being becomes the moment they believe they're alone in the universe, free of any judgment, free of any meaning at all. Now, here's where we have to be honest about the strongest objection to all of this, because it matters. Critics have pointed out, fairly, that this kind of thinking can slide into something dangerous, a romanticizing of pain, almost a glorification of suffering for its own sake. If suffering reveals truth, does that mean we should seek it out? Does it mean people in real, ongoing pain, grief, illness, trauma should just be told to find the lesson in it? That would be cruel. And it isn't what Dostoevsky is arguing, even if his prose sometimes tempts readers toward that reading. Sartre and Camus, who both acknowledged his influence, broke from him right here. Sartre called freedom a condemnation. Camus called the absurd an invitation to revolt. Dostoevsky, almost alone, still bet on redemption. Why does that distinction matter? Because it draws the actual line. Chasing pain isn't the point, but turning away from it completely, refusing to let it teach you anything, that comes at its own cost. So try this. Not the firing squad, you don't need that. Just take the last time something broke you. The diagnosis, the phone call, the door closing on something you thought was permanent. Now, ask yourself honestly, in that moment, did you see something true about yourself that the comfortable version of your life had been quietly hiding? Not something poetic, something plain and a little uncomfortable, a vanity, a fear, a way you'd been lying to yourself about how strong you were. Sit with that for a second. That's the exact terrain Dostoevsky spent his entire life inside. There's one scene from the labor camp Dostoevsky never stopped writing about. He watched a prisoner flogged in front of the entire camp, hundreds of blows, in the open air, while the other men were forced to stand and watch. He wrote about it years later in a book called The House of the Dead, and what haunted him wasn't only the cruelty of it, it was what happened afterward. The same guards who administered the beating went home that night, ate dinner with their families, and carried on with their lives as though nothing extraordinary had happened. That's the sentence that should stop you, not monsters do terrible things. Ordinary men do terrible things and go on eating dinner. Dostoevsky's conclusion wasn't despair. It was something closer to responsibility. If cruelty could live that comfortably inside an ordinary man, then so quietly could its opposite. Conscience, compassion, the capacity to actually see the person suffering in front of you instead of looking away. The camp didn't just show him the worst of what people can do, it showed him how easily we stop noticing it. Keep that image close, because it's exactly the muscle our own culture is quietly letting atrophy. Here's the problem. We live in a culture engineered, almost architecturally, to make sure you never have to sit there for long. Notice how it actually works, moment to moment. You feel a flicker of sadness on the drive home, and before it even fully lands, your thumb is already opening an app to drown it out. A friend starts telling you something painful, and within 30 seconds, someone reaches for "everything happens for a reason." Not because it's true, but because it ends the conversation. That's not comfort. That's an exit. Nobody sets out to suffer for suffering's sake, and no one should have to. But somewhere in our obsessive pursuit of comfort, something else has been quietly lost. Discomfort has been rebranded as malfunction. Grief, loneliness, rejection, inevitable, unavoidable parts of being alive now get treated like bugs in the system that need an immediate patch. Even our language gives it away. We don't say we're sad anymore. We say we're not okay, as if sadness itself were the diagnosis, instead of an ordinary human weather pattern. And because we no longer have the emotional vocabulary to actually sit with these experiences, we collapse the moment they show up. we feel weak, defective, alone in it, even though every single person scrolling next to us on the subway is quietly carrying the exact same thing behind a performance of being fine. Here's the part nobody wants to hear. Here's the cruel paradox. The harder we run from pain, the more it catches up with us. Anxiety climbs. So does isolation. Loneliness, in some surveys, is now described almost like a public health crisis in a country more connected, more entertained, and more comfortable than at almost any point in its history. Not despite all our comfort, because of how allergic we've become to anything that isn't comfort. And this is where everything reorganizes. Dostoevsky isn't suggesting suffering is a punishment you have to decode, or a problem to solve so you can get back to feeling fine. He's suggesting something stranger. Suffering is a mirror. Not the mirror that shows you the version of yourself you've rehearsed for other people, the competent one, the composed one. A mirror that shows you the parts you've been quietly avoiding, the vanity dressed up as virtue, the arrogance you've been calling independence, the fragility hiding underneath what you thought was self-control. When you're in real pain, there isn't much room left for masks, and that, precisely that, is where something honest becomes possible for the first time. This is the reversal. The problem was never that suffering exists. The problem is what happens when we refuse to let it show us anything at all. So what do you actually do with this the next time pain shows up at your door? Because it will. First, the Stoic move Epictetus taught, 20 centuries before any of us needed it. Separate what you can control from what you can't. You cannot control that the loss happened. You can control whether you spend your energy fighting the fact of it or turn your attention to what it's actually asking you to notice. Second, borrow from Frankl. He watched inside a concentration camp that the prisoners who survived psychologically weren't the ones who denied their suffering. They were the ones who found some thread of meaning inside it, however small. Not an explanation for why it happened. Nobody owes you that. Just a reason to carry it forward. Third, name it precisely instead of managing it vaguely. I'm not okay tells no one, including you, what's actually happening. I'm grieving. I'm humiliated. I'm afraid I made an irreversible mistake. Each of those gives the feeling an actual shape, and a shape is something you can finally examine instead of just endure. And finally, resist the urge, yours or someone else's, to rush the healing. The next time you're hurting and someone offers you a quick fix, a slogan, a let's talk about something else, notice what that impulse is actually doing. It isn't helping you, it's helping them not have to witness you in it. Real strength was never about avoiding the descent, it's about staying conscious while you're in it. This doesn't mean seeking out pain, it means when it inevitably finds you, refusing to look away from what it's showing you. Remember the question we opened with. Why does the suffering we spend our lives avoiding seem to hold the sharpest mirror we'll ever look into? Now, back to that letter. Hours after nearly being executed, still shaking back in his cell, Dostoevsky wrote to his brother Mikhail. And what he wrote wasn't about the horror he'd just survived. It was almost the opposite. He described life itself, the plainest, most ordinary fact of still being alive, as something closer to a gift he'd never actually noticed he'd been holding. Not a lesson about suffering, a sudden, violent clarity about the minutes he'd spent his whole life failing to see. That's the twist worth sitting with. We've spent this entire video treating suffering as the thing that reveals the truth, and it does. But notice what Dostoevsky actually discovered in that cell. It wasn't a truth about pain at all. It was a truth about the ordinary, unremarkable minute you're living in right now, the one you're probably only half paying attention to, because nothing about it feels urgent enough to deserve your full presence. He spent the rest of his life writing from the far side of a firing squad that never fired. Siberia, epilepsy, debt, grief, none of it broke that clarity. If anything, it kept sharpening it. So here's what actually stays with you after this video ends. Not seek out suffering. Not even suffering builds character. Something quieter and harder to shake. The version of you that finally shows up honestly, masks off, no performance, usually only shows up when everything else has been stripped away. The real question was never whether pain will find you. It will. The question is whether you'll wait for a firing squad to notice you're alive.